Thank you for being here so late in the last day of the conference. Thank you for being here. And to spice things up, at the end of the day, we're going to talk about standards, right? yeah, I see some enthusiastic people. Nice. Okay, so this is a story that's been in the making for a couple of years of the way I've been interacting with IEC standards in my work at Alliander on open source. And I've noticed it's very sometimes a struggle to share this because it also comes to minute details. So I want to do that here today, and I'm glad to have given the opportunity to share that all with you. So who is speaking to you here? I work at Alliander in the open source program office, also as a solution architect for the development platform. But I have a history in a background in electrical engineering, where I worked with standards and then did something with home energy management systems, and smart meter data, then microgrid, and now I support multiple open source projects. And in this work, I got involved with multiple standards, a number of which are the big names in IEC standards we've been seeing throughout the conference: 61850, SIM, right, CGMES. So I've seen quite a bit of that. And as I started to introduce, the reason I'm presenting here is because I've been at this for 2021. And I've been addressing things with IEC and national standardization bodies, but so far the discussion or the conversation is rather difficult. So I thought I'll just put it out here and hopefully get the conversation going, be constructive. Also, this is about IEC, but I guess maybe the criticism that might be on the things, how they're going, might also apply to other standardization bodies. So this doesn't have to be IEC specific. With those disclaimers sort of out of the way, let's be very positive that we have standardization in electrical, in energy systems, because it's so crucial for interoperability. When we talk about the energy transition, everybody has to participate. So the interoperability is key, but then also the independence. That's also why we love open source, I guess, to have a collaborative, open platform. Also a place for collaboration. And then standards specifically is something you could test against. So standards are key. That's why we want to use them in our open source project. The first challenge we run into is that standards are not publicly available. And in the example of 61850, you pay 26,000 euros to actually get the full set of standards. It's in Swiss francs, but I did the math for you. And then you're not allowed to share the documents, which is fine. I mean, we work at a big company, and all the employees have access, and many of the parties involved with the standards do as well. There's draft standards, so this is very workable. But then you have hobbyist engineers. We have them in open source projects. They worked in a field, and then they start working somewhere else, and they no longer have access to the standard, but in the nighttime, they want to contribute. Or they went with pension and still want to contribute, but then they no longer have access to the standard. In open source, this is rather common. Same for somebody who's actually an end user, but finds an issue and lacks the standard to actually look up what is it, how is it supposed to work. And then within our organization, I see people that actually have access to the standard, but accessing is so cumbersome that they rather go online, look at what's actually in an existing library and read the source code with the possibility of copying mistakes that others have made in the implementation. But okay, this is the status quo, so standards documents are not public and shareable, but especially in this communication standards, the protocol is the key thing we have to implement. So maybe we can just use the published protocol from the standard directly. And would we be allowed to do that? So that brings us to the second challenge, that the protocol license is not open source compatible. And I break it down. If you have a protocol, 61850, for example, you have an XSD. This is the protocol definition. And if you implement this, you have to copy this verbatim. There's no creativity allowed. We're implementing a protocol. So maybe only if you convert XML to JSON, you would end up with something else. But otherwise, all the abbreviations, all the fields will be exactly the same. And TC57 of IEC concluded that, and they said, OK, let's just publish these files, which is great. very happy that they do that because it just makes sense. But because every work based on that is also a legal derivative in terms of copyright. So that makes it interesting also about the licensing. And then going online, I'll show a screenshot. All the technical properties, protocol definitions are published. And they have a specific license, the Code Components End User License Agreement, the EULA. And I conclude that it's not an open source license. And this whole process at its current state is also still a draft status. So I don't know what it in practice means, but it seems that it hasn't been finalized yet. That's something minor maybe. So this is the website of TC57 where you can find the code components. Again, very great that they're doing this. You can download the zip files of the light code components, just the protocol definitions to use in your project. And this is some examples from the publication protocol, the process, in which it says a code component is a piece of information intended to be directly processed by a computer and encoded. Right, so this is about, you need it verbatim if you implement a protocol. And it says something about free and public access to have these files available. But then in the files, there's this code components end user license agreement. And when you read it, it looks like very much like a BSD 3-clause license. But if you read it closely, the first line, it says, redistributions of software must retain the copyright notice. And it sort of hints at that it's actually redistributable, that you can copy this. And then it puts up two bullets that say you can only modify it to the extent that the standard suggests or permits, and any clarifications by IEC. So you can only change the protocol by permission of IEC. And then looking at the open source definition, the OSD, there's some clauses of what do we consider open source, and one of them is the ability to modify, right, without any restrictions, derivative works. And I think these clauses of the IEC permission does not make it accessible with the, you can not make a combination with open source in this sense. But okay, then it's maybe not open source, but it's still public. So we want to embed it in our project because that's easier. In this case, we have a project, and from the code components, we actually generate the library code, which we actually have in the implementation. And it would be great if we can just include it in a repository, because developers love this. We have everything we started from, we can automate it, and for transparency, completeness, reproducibility, we would have this available. So that will be great. That brings us to the third challenge. Actually, there's some uncertainty about this license, because it said something about redistribution, but it wasn't so clear as you would get from an open source license, let alone the modification. Let's ask IEC. And I tried multiple times, also via the national bodies, via the working groups. And the answers I got was that actually the light code components require a commercial license for redistribution. Something about royalties in some cases, or that actually you can only sell this. Which is a bit odd when I ask open source lawyers, then they say, oh, but this is a protocol, right? There's not a creative work, it's maybe even not copyrightable. You should just be able to implement this in your code, because that's why they made the standard in the first place. So there's some ambiguity here, which is not helpful, because in my situation, I have access to lawyers. I can say, okay, we understand this, we accept the risk. But anybody else who just asked the IEC would get a different answer than maybe is the norm. So I think we need clarity in this field. And you could even say that any existing open source implementation in this way might actually be illegal in the sense of IEC. So I think that's a bit tedious, but yeah. So this is maybe a dead end in that sense, which will be worthwhile for a conversation. And then there's another issue we encountered, and that is actually that these code components that are published publicly are not complete. This should be, according to the process, for everything that is machine readable, should be in the light as well. But there was one file, a specific NSDoc file with abbreviations that you need for IEC 61850. It was not in there. And you need this because in the protocol, it's just 3-letter abbreviations. But if you implement software, you want to serve the user with the full text, which is also part of the standard, so to have clear definitions. If this is not included, then how do you actually get this? So, okay, not all files are public, and we have some licensing issues. We can do something else. Let's do bring your own files, right? Everybody buys the standard, the users. And this is what we did in OpenSCD, or I'd say we, right? The project did this. You can actually upload the files and start using it. And then it turns out that actually you run into another issue, and that is the fact that not only are some files missing, but also depending on where you get these files from, you get different files. In this particular case, the software development was done by the national body of the Netherlands, and they had the B3 variant of the standard. And the user was going through IEC, and they got the whole package with everything in it. And they had the latest version of this protocol, of this file, which was the B5. And it had some changes. Some were technically breaking. I mean, minor changes, improvements. But still, the validations that were in the user interface made it so that this broke. And then there was a GitHub discussion like, oh, I cannot use the software because I get an error. And it's like, huh, why are you having a different file? Yeah, we have a different file. And we tried to track it down via our national standardization body, but we could not get access. And we tried multiple times of this. And so put it in a diagram here, you have the standard with the different variants, B3 to B5, I don't know, maybe in the future, or maybe already there's a B6. And the software developers got the B3, and then the users got the B5, and it didn't work. And somehow, when I download it today via our national organization, we get the B4. And I cannot get B3 again. So it's lost forever, and you cannot get the other versions. And then I guess this all brings me to the other challenge, how to explain all this, which I just did. And I guess the people here in the room are familiar with open source and software development, so you probably comprehend what this means in practice. But in dialogue with the standardization bodies, I really have a struggle to explain this and get this across, because you talk with the marketing sales department, and then they relay it back to the legal department. And sort of the convention seems to be that everything is about proprietary software, whereas open source has different conventions that put things in a different light. And then if you are somebody who is saying, oh, you have a good point here, but actually I'm not the one who can actually make a decision on this because it has to be by that committee or something else. So everybody's talking, pointing fingers at each other, which I understand, but that is very hard to improve it. So to recap, these are the points I addressed, and to save a bit of time, I'll skip, keep the pace. To put it in a light, what actually openness can bring. So the CGMES model was published by NSOE under Apache 2.0, so real open source license, and yet it was still in a proprietary format in Spark's Enterprise Architect. And so the people from Netbeheer Nederland, the Dutch Association of Grid Operators, took this file and created a linked data model out of it, LinkML, which can be extended, from which you can generate pydantic data validation or something else. And they are now also publishing that on a web page where you can click through, have the documentation there, and they are now working on profiles. So they're taking the standard, they're making it clearer, they're making it easier to implement, and they make it able to experiment and make it easier to adopt. And I would hope that these are some of the things that open source can bring to standards in general. So in that regard, openness makes sense. And openness also makes sense to lawmakers, right? It's not just here, the in-crowd. No, lawmakers do understand this. And to highlight this, in the US at the moment, they are now working to revisit their standards strategy. And in the text, they say that open collaboration on standards, open data, and open source software have penetrated many layers of technology and industry. And also, software and data have become integral to contemporary standards development. So there's really intertwined. And also, that actually standards are now also happening with open source development communities. So this is recognized. And there's a consultation in the US that is only until the 19th of September. So if you're in the US with your organization, please just write a short note as a shout out, like, we know open source and this is important. And it's the same in the EU in a way. So there was a EU Commission report that highlighted some things about open source as well, that there's a limited recognition of open source technology by standardization bodies, that there were multiple people that participated in the first consultation that addressed this, or raised this issue, and that in general, the open source software community should be more engaged with standardization activities. And the important role of open standards as more companies rely on open source projects. So these are key points. And for the EU, there will be a consultation a bit later. They planned it for Q2, but okay, that already passed. So it's just waiting for the moment when the consultation comes up. And then again, the question is, if you're based in the EU, please write and say this is important. The more voices really help. Then yesterday we had a great community meetup, the Standards and Open Source meetup, where we discussed about open source and standards and how could that work. And I think in light of these consultations, some of the things we came up with that could be improved and seem also achievable is that we would like to have legal guarantees in place for open source implementation. So there's no fuzziness, is this legal or not? That standardization bodies actually can benefit from open source reference implementations because if it's easier to adopt and the protocols are better, actually the number of people implementing the standard and wanting to participate and wanting to buy the standard increases. So the total sort of ocean in which you're fishing increases. And also, we want standards to be adopted in the first place. So this should be good. And as said today by, I think it was Pionic's presentation, it also helps to have the sandbox there, so you can actually experiment. And another point was that if there's an existing open standard and it's submitted, then actually it should remain open, because the protocols we're talking about today actually have quite an open origin, but over time they became more closed. About open standards, I wanted to avoid the definition in my presentation. But if you want to go there, I recommend this presentation at Open Source Summit Europe last year. And so my call to action is just speak up. We have a wiki with the standards in which you can also highlight some of the cases you run into. You can contact, with your cases, the standardization body directly, and you can also participate in these consultations. Thank you.